911, what's your emergency?
The Orca has Jessica and won't let go. She's been underwater for over a minute. Send help immediately!
The waters of Victoria Harbor in British Columbia are cold and unforgiving, even in summer. But on February 20th, 1991, they became something far worse. They became a killing ground for a 20-year-old woman whose only crime was loving the ocean and the creatures that lived in it. Kelty Byrne should have gone home that day. She should have called her parents, studied for her marine biology exams at the University of Victoria, maybe grabbed dinner with friends. Instead, she became the first documented victim of what would later be recognized as one of the most dangerous mistakes in modern entertainment history. Her death would expose a dark truth that the marine park industry had been hiding for decades, but it would take 2 more deaths and years of cover-ups before the world finally listened. This isn't just a story about a tragic accident. This is the story of how humanity's arrogance and greed created monsters out of magnificent creatures, and how one young woman's dreams of protecting marine life became her death sentence. Kelty wasn't like other college students. While her classmates were focused on parties and grades, she was already living her purpose. Born with an almost supernatural connection to water, she had been a champion swimmer since childhood, moving through pools and oceans like she belonged there more than on land. Her instructors at the University of Victoria described her as brilliant, dedicated, and driven by something deeper than academic success. She didn't want to study marine biology for the prestige or the career prospects. She wanted to save the oceans. Every research paper she wrote, every lab experiment she conducted, every hour she spent in the library was motivated by a single burning desire to make the world safer for the creatures she loved. Her professors remember her staying late into the night, poring over research about whale, communication, orca family structures, and the devastating effects of pollution on marine ecosystems. When she heard about the part-time position at Sealand of the Pacific, it seemed like destiny. Here was a chance to work directly with orcas, those magnificent apex predators she had admired since childhood. She could earn money for school while building hands-on experience with the animals she hoped to protect for the rest of her life. What could be more perfect? But Sealand of the Pacific was nothing like the gleaming SeaWorld parks that dominated American tourism. It was a modest, almost shabby operation floating on the cold waters of Victoria Harbor. The entire facility consisted of a floating pen system and a few simple buildings where tourists could buy snacks and souvenirs. The real attraction was the 3 killer whales trapped in what amounted to a concrete bathtub. The conditions were primitive by any standard. The main performance area was a circular pool barely large enough for the whales to build up swimming speed before hitting the walls. But even worse was the holding area where the orcas spent their nights and off hours. Called the module pen, it was a pitch-black metal box so cramped that the 3 massive animals could barely move without touching each other. Imagine being locked in a closet with 2 other people for 12 hours every night, with no light, no space to escape, and no way to communicate your frustration except through violence. That's what these intelligent social creatures endured every single day of their captivity. The psychological damage was inevitable, but nobody at Sealand seemed to understand what they were creating. Kelty threw herself into her work with characteristic passion. She arrived early every morning and stayed late every evening, learning everything she could about orca behavior and care. She memorized their feeding schedules, studied their individual personalities, and developed a genuine affection for each of the 3 whales. To her, they weren't just attractions or performing animals. They were individuals with complex emotions and social needs. Tilikum was the largest and, in many ways, the most tragic. Captured off the coast of Iceland when he was barely 2 years old, he had been ripped away from his mother and family pod at the most crucial stage of his development. Male orcas in the wild typically stay with their mothers for life, learning complex social behaviors and hunting techniques that can't be replicated in captivity. Tilikum had been robbed of all of that, turned into a performing commodity before he even understood what family meant. By the time he arrived at Sealand, he was already showing signs of psychological damage. At over 20 feet long and weighing more than 6 tons, he was physically dominant, but the artificial social structure of captivity had made him the victim of constant abuse from the 2 females. In the wild, orca social hierarchies are complex and based on family relationships, age, and experience. In the tiny confines of Sealand, they became brutal and primitive. Haida was the alpha female, taken from the wild as an adult and forced to adapt to a completely alien environment. Her natural maternal instincts had been twisted by years of confinement and failed pregnancies. She ruled the small pod through violence and intimidation, taking out her frustration on anyone weaker than herself. Nuka, the other female, followed Haida's lead, participating in the daily torture that had become Tilikum's reality. Every night in the Module P.N., the two females would rake their teeth across Tilikum's body, leaving deep, bleeding wounds that never fully healed before new ones were inflicted. They bit him, rammed him, and used their superior numbers to corner him in the tiny space. The staff at Sealand knew this was happening. They could see the fresh scars on Tilikum's body every morning, but they treated it as normal whale behavior rather than the psychological breakdown it really represented. Kelty saw the scars too, but like everyone else at the facility, she was told that this was simply how orcas established dominance. Nobody explained to her that wild orcas rarely engage in this kind of sustained, brutal aggression. Nobody told her that these weren't normal whale behaviors, but the desperate actions of traumatized animals losing their grip on sanity. She loved them anyway. Every morning, she would brush their teeth with care and attention, talking to them in the soft, gentle voice that had always calmed frightened animals. She prepared their meals with precision, making sure each whale got the right amount of food and supplements. She spent hours training with them, using positive reinforcement techniques and building what she believed was a relationship based on trust and mutual respect. But trust is a fragile thing, and trauma has a way of destroying it without warning. The warning signs were there for anyone who knew how to read them. Marine mammal experts had been raising concerns about orca captivity for years, pointing to increased aggression, self-destructive behaviors, and the shortened lifespans of whales in captivity compared to their wild counterparts. But the entertainment industry was making too much money to pay attention to inconvenient scientific evidence. Sealand was particularly problematic because of its primitive facilities and inadequate safety protocols. Unlike larger marine parks, they had no emergency procedures for separating whales from trainers, no tranquilizer guns, no physical barriers that could be deployed in case of an incident. The staff relied entirely on their belief that the whales were predictable and controllable. They were catastrophically wrong. February 20th, 1991, started like any other day at Sealand. Kelty arrived early, enthusiastic as always about her work with the whales. The morning show had gone well, with all three orcas performing their routines without incident. Tourists took their photos, children pressed their faces against the glass, and everyone went home believing they had witnessed a heartwarming display of the bond between humans and nature. But after the crowds left, the real work began. Kelty was preparing the afternoon feeding, measuring out fish and supplements with her usual meticulous care. The whales were in the main performance pool, swimming in their endless circles, waiting for their meal. It was routine, familiar, safe, until it wasn't. Nobody saw exactly what happened. One moment Kelty was standing on the platform, and the next she was in the water. Later investigations would focus obsessively on whether she slipped, was pulled, or fell accidentally. But that detail, debated endlessly in media reports, missed the point entirely. However she ended up in the water, what happened next revealed the horrible truth about what Sealand had created. Kelty surfaced immediately, her swimming training kicking in automatically. She was calm, competent, reaching for the edge of the pool. For a few seconds, everyone watching probably thought this would be just an embarrassing slip, a story to laugh about later. Kelty certainly wasn't panicking. She had been in this pool before, during training exercises. She knew these whales better than almost anyone. But she didn't know what they had become. Tilikum moved first. The massive male, scarred and psychologically broken by years of abuse, grabbed Kelty's foot and pulled her under. Even then, witnesses later said, they thought it might be playful behavior. Orcas are naturally curious, and trainers often interacted with them in the water during supervised sessions. But this wasn't play. This was something far darker. When Kelty surfaced again, gasping and disoriented, Haida was waiting for her. The alpha female seized the young woman and dove deep, taking her down into the darker regions of the pool where the watching staff couldn't see clearly what was happening. Kelty fought to the surface again, and Nuka took her turn, grabbing the struggling woman and disappearing beneath the waves. What followed was the longest 10 minutes in the history of Sealand of the Pacific. The three orcas began passing Kelty between them like a living toy, each taking turns dragging her under, releasing her just long enough for her to gasp for air, then seizing her again. It wasn't coordinated like a hunt. It was chaotic, frenzied, like the actions of animals that had finally snapped under psychological pressure they could no longer contain. The staff scrambled into emergency mode, but their options were pathetically limited. They threw life rings into the water, hoping to give Kelty something to grab onto. They used long poles to try to distract the whales. They threw nets, buckets, anything they could find. Nothing worked. The orcas were completely focused on Kelty, ignoring everything else happening around them. Steve Huckster, one of the trainers on duty that day, would later describe the scene as something from a nightmare. The whales weren't behaving like the animals he had worked with for years. They had become something else entirely, something primal and terrifying. Every attempt to rescue Kelty failed because the staff had never imagined they would need to rescue someone from their supposedly gentle giants. The most haunting moment came near the end. Kelty managed to surface one final time, her arms reaching desperately for the edge of the pool that remained just out of reach. Her voice, weak and filled with terror, carried across the water as she cried out the words that would haunt everyone who heard them. "I don't want to die." Then Tilikum pulled her under for the last time. The silence that followed was deafening. For several minutes the pool was still, the three whales floating motionless as if exhausted by their brutal game. When emergency divers finally entered the water, they found Kelty's body at the bottom of the pool, battered and broken beyond recognition. The woman who had dedicated her life to protecting marine animals had been killed by the very creatures she loved most. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Paramedics worked frantically to revive Kelty, but it was far too late. She had been underwater too long, suffered too much trauma. The staff at Sealand stood in shocked silence, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Many of them had worked with these whales for years without incident. How could their trusted animals have turned into killers? But the real chaos was just beginning. News of Kelty's death spread quickly through Victoria and beyond. Media outlets descended on Sealand, demanding answers about how a trained professional could be killed by performing whales. Animal rights activists, who had been protesting orca captivity for years, pointed to Kelty's death as proof of what they had been saying all along. Sealand's management tried desperately to control the narrative. They described Kelty's death as a tragic accident, emphasizing her slip into the water rather than the systematic brutality that followed. They insisted that the whales had simply been playing too roughly, that there was no malicious intent behind their actions. But the public wasn't buying it. Eyewitness accounts began to emerge, describing the deliberate, sustained nature of the attack. Marine biologists who had long warned about the psychological effects of captivity spoke out about the predictable nature of what had happened. Former Sealand employees came forward with stories about the whale's increasingly aggressive behavior in the months leading up to Kelty's death. The pressure became overwhelming. Protesters gathered outside Sealand's gates daily, calling for the facility to be shut down. Tourism plummeted as families decided they didn't want to risk exposing their children to potentially dangerous animals. Insurance companies balked at covering a facility that had proven unable to protect its own staff. Within months of Kelty's death, Sealand of the Pacific announced it was closing permanently. The 3 killer whales that had killed her would be shipped off to other marine parks, carrying their trauma and their capacity for violence with them. Tilikum's journey was just beginning. SeaWorld Orlando acquired the massive male, rebranding him as a gentle giant and the star of their breeding program. His dark past at Sealand was buried beneath marketing campaigns and choreographed shows. Tourists flocked to see him perform, unaware that they were watching a killer. But the damage was permanent. In 1999, Tilikum killed again. Daniel Dukes, a troubled young man who had somehow gained access to SeaWorld after hours, was found dead in Tilikum's pool, his body mutilated and draped across the whale's back. SeaWorld dismissed it as the tragic result of a trespasser's poor judgment, not the predictable action of a psychologically damaged animal. The pattern continued. In 2010, Veteran SeaWorld trainer Dawn Brancho was killed by Tilikum during a live performance, grabbed and thrashed violently underwater for 45 minutes while horrified audiences watched. 3 deaths spanning nearly 20 years, all connected to a single whale whose psychological break had begun in the cramped, dark confines of Sealand of the Pacific. Kelty Byrne had been the first warning, but nobody had listened. Her family was left to grieve in private, their daughter's death reduced to a footnote in discussions about marine park safety. No criminal charges were ever filed. No compensation was paid. No one was held accountable for creating the conditions that led to her death. The corporate machinery simply moved on, as if closing Sealand's gates could erase what had happened there. But Kelty's story refused to disappear. Every time Tilikum's violence made headlines, her name resurfaced as the first victim in a pattern of predictable tragedy. Marine biologists and animal rights activists used her death as evidence of what happens when we try to domesticate apex predators for entertainment. The 2013 documentary Blackfish brought Kelty's story to a global audience, showing how her death had been the beginning of a much larger tragedy. Public opinion began to shift as people learned the truth about what really happens behind the cheerful facade of marine entertainment. Today, Kelty Byrne's legacy lives on in every empty Orca tank, every marine park that has chosen to phase out whale shows, every person who questions whether wild animals belong in concrete pools for human entertainment. She was 20 years old when she died, full of dreams about protecting the ocean and its creatures. In the most tragic way possible, she accomplished exactly that. Her death cracked open the facade of marine entertainment, revealing the psychological torture inflicted on intelligent social creatures torn from their natural environment. The ripples from that cold February day in 1991 continue to spread, forcing humanity to confront the cost of our arrogance and the price paid by both animals and humans when we try to cage the wild. Kelty Byrne wanted to make a difference. She did. Her voice echoes in every empty tank, every closed marine park, every moment when we choose compassion over entertainment. She will not be forgotten,